My name's Tom Fardner, I'm Chair in Grand Rouse today. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for enduring the power cut, and we'll crack on. So, a few parish notices. The University of Dundee has become the first university in the UK to produce medical graduates through the Science Without Borders scheme. The graduation ceremony at Dundee University was last week, and saw 4 Brazilian students graduating from the medical school, having completed an intercalated course for the honours degree of Bachelor of Medical Science. So this is Rami Aboud in the middle there, and he and Carlos Vigderovic, orthopaedic surgeon, have been the first people in the UK to take these Brazilian medical students, put them through a degree course, and they have graduated as the first in their class. You may have seen this on the BBC website. Stuart Clark received his degree in product design this week in one of the other colleges, and while on the stage he was presented with the Scottish Cancer Prevention Network Art and Design Prize 2015 for Exposed, his final year project to help users track the levels of UV rays their skin is absorbing. So this thing here is Exposed, and it's a smart bracelet UV indicator that changes colour depending on the UV levels surrounding the user. It's a wearable device and aimed at young people new to the outdoors. You have to be a pretty young person to be new to the outdoors. Perhaps it's aimed at Dundonians who are new to the sun. And the design takes form of a paracord bracelet. The overall function is to be used in an emergency, but incorporating this smart UV feature allows it to be used on a daily basis. So presumably to be found in the Apple Watch version 2.0. The belief that vitamin D deficiency from lack of sunshine, like childhood ricket, causes increased heart disease and deaths in winter has been challenged by a research team from the University of Dundee. The research, led by Emeritus Professor Hugh Tunstall-Pedo and published in the International Journal of Epidemiology, suggests that vitamin D is not guilty and is unimportant in cardiovascular disease and winter deaths, whatever its role is in other diseases. And I've spoken about this a number of times, but I'm very pleased to have the first opportunity to tell you about the success of the Archie's Mountain Challenge. It started on the 30th of May and finished on June the 14th, finishing 5 days earlier than predicted. So anaesthetists Paul Fettis and Ben Elliott coordinated this mammoth challenge of running up all the Scottish mountains over 1,000 metres elevation and travelling between them all by human power alone in under 3 weeks. And despite high winds, rain, sleet and snow for the first week, the challenge was completed on day 16. There were about 50 runners, a dozen cyclists, half a dozen kayakers and a host of support crew, and they travelled over 1,300 kilometres and climbed over 70,000 metres and went through more than one pair of trainers. The current total amount raised for the Archie Foundation is over £17,000, and certainly raised awareness of the Archie Foundation in Tayside. And the cameramen from this adventure show followed us round, and I'm afraid that the people they followed round were me and John Irvin, wherever he is, in here somewhere, and they did interview us, so you may have to be forced to listen to us waffling as we climb the Larry Grue. Next week, the Medicine for the Elderly Department will discuss Parkinson's disease, from Dr. Parkinson's initial observations through to modern therapeutic methods and ongoing research in the field, including work done in Dundee. But this week, Dr. Ben Shippey, Director of Clinical Skills, wearer of exquisite waistcoats, although not today, disappointingly, keeper of a fine beard and motorsport playboy, was going to talk us through his waistcoat collection, but I've persuaded him instead to talk about 15 years of motorsport rescue. There you go. Thank you, Ben.
I'm very pleased Tom's put that picture up, because I've been looking for it all week and I can't find it. So I don't know where you found it, but I'm really pleased that you did.
I found it on Google.
Really?
Oh, yes.
And now that's quite frightening, actually.
I can't get your presentation on the screen now.
Can you not?
Well, no.
That's okay, it's a blank screen.
Just a blank screen.
It is blank.
Oh, well, that it is up.
So
Thank you very much, everyone.
An enormous pleasure. I hope everybody has come to be entertained rather than informed. I suspect that you will go away not much the wiser about how to do it, but you'll have some idea of how it goes. Nobody died. Nobody was hurt, actually, in that extraordinary accident in Portugal. Not one of mine, I wasn't there. you can see how quickly something can turn from a motorsport event into a catastrophe. And we sadly in this country have very good experience of that, about which I will tell you a bit more later. The story of motorsport rescue really starts with this guy. This is Jackie Stewart, the guy on the left, I'm sure as you will know, Dumbarton lad, who in 1966 crashed his car at Spa-Francorchamps in Belgium into a barn. Two other competitors borrowed some tools from a spectator and extracted him from the car while he sat in a pool of petrol. Somebody turned up with a van, they chucked him in the back, they took him out of the van on a stretcher, they put him in a stretcher in the pit village surrounded by fag ends. Nobody really knew what to do. Eventually an ambulance was found. They took him to Liège in an ambulance with a police escort that lost them on the way, and the ambulance didn't know where to go. So that was the state of affairs in motorsport rescue in '66. He subsequently took his own doctor to every motor racing event that he went to. But he formed a very good partnership with this fantastic old boy, Prof. Sid Watkins, now sadly dead, in the 70s. And they really introduced the concept that actually a GP, nothing about GPs, with no specialist trauma training, sitting at the side of a race circuit in his tweeds, drinking claret, was probably not an acceptable medical or rescue service for motorsport events. And over the course of really 3 decades, Jackie and Sid and the FIA between them, and I'm talking now about Formula One, reduced the number of annual deaths from somewhere round about, these are decade deaths, from somewhere round about 15 drivers in the 50s, to 2000s when we actually had none. Sadly, we have had 1 indirect death in the 2010. What are we going to call those? Noughties was easy. I'm not sure what we call this decade. Through the introduction really of some rules about some very simple things, helmets and seatbelts, overalls, opening the cockpit entry so that people could get out of the cars in a hurry, 6-point harnesses, and then the invention of monocoque chassis, energy dissipating chassis, and then starting to crash test repeatedly the cars that took part in FIA events. Many more over the last 2 decades have resulted in 0 deaths. And this is really interesting if you put it actually in the context of the number of racing kilometres, that's the yellow line, that happened over a similar period of time. As cars got faster, the races stayed the same duration, so they got longer. The number of kilometres raced went up, the number of entries went up, and the number of accidents went up, while at the same time the number of serious injuries went down. And I think if you look at an industry that really has paid attention to engineering its way out of what was catastrophic in the 50s and 60s, you could not find a better example than the FIA and Formula One, who have thrown an enormous amount of time and resource at solving this problem. My story is a little bit more prosaic. My story starts here. I was lucky enough to go to Northampton to do my house jobs, my medical house jobs. And I liked it so much I went back to be an SHO there. Realised very quickly that it was just down the road from Silverstone. It's about 15 miles down the A43 to Silverstone, which is where I really got involved in motorsport medicine and enjoyed it very much there. It has become almost a point of honour that anybody that has ever worked at Northampton or does work in Northampton shows this slide, which I think is a fantastic piece of NHS signage. It has absolutely no relevance to my presentation, but it has to go there. So this is Silverstone. This is Silverstone as it is now. This is the new wing complex that's been built down at the Abbey corner. And just to the left there, between the white strips, at the top of the grandstands on the left, is where I stood for last year's British Grand Prix. I'm actually leaving tonight at 6 o'clock to drive down again to join them again for this year's competition. So I had 3 years of circuit racing at Silverstone. It was all very much then about the excitement, the possibility of serious injury, the blue flashing lights, the sirens. It was rushing about trying to do heroic and life-saving things with your pants on over your trousers. In 1999, I had to move away from the glamour of Silverstone up to Scotland, where I completed my training, where I noticed some differences about the motorsport that was on offer. The wildlife was different. This is a Silverstone hare giving a Ford Escort Mark II a run for its money. In Scotland, it seemed to be largely that the insects were much more in number and smaller than they were, and we spent a lot of time standing out in the forest. The weather was different. But more importantly, the motorsport that was on offer up here was also different. I was very used to this kind of environment where you line up 20 or 30 cars, you flash a green light, they all race around against each other, the first one to cross the finish line wins. When forest rallying actually is very different. There is a route, cars set off one at a time and they race across special stages which are timed against the clock, and the times at the end of the day are added up and the person with the shortest time wins. So they're not actually racing against each other side by side, they're racing the clock. There are other differences. This is a map of Silverstone as it is now, actually. It wasn't like that when I left it. This is an area of around 10 square miles, within which the whole event is contained. And it's very easy to see how you can respond to incidents that happen within that contained environment. This is the area that was covered by one of the events for which I was Chief Medical Officer in 2008, I think. This is the Lombard. This started in Harrogate, and it went just to the edge of Loch Fyne and back again over the course of 3 days. We covered over 1,200 miles. And you can see how trying to respond to incidents within an area that size takes an awful lot more organisation and logistics. The liaison for that event involved speaking to 11 different regional fire, police and ambulance services. So that was a huge logistics exercise. But within those long routes, each stage, which is only run once, cars will go through it sequentially. We'll start at one end, in this case up the top left-hand corner, and we'll finish at the other end. This is the longest stage we've ever had, but this is 25 miles long, give or take. Within that stage at any one time, there will be anything between 20 and 30 competing cars. And we can't see them all, about which a bit more later. We also, if you think about it, have to follow those cars. We can't go against the traffic because everybody is coming at you down very narrow roads. This is the resource at Silverstone in 2003. This is a 2003 picture. About 40 doctors there, 5 rescue ambulances, 3 medical teams of anaesthetist and paramedic and racing driver in a fast car. 3 extrication teams too, all of whom have 4 or 5 rescue crew and a doctor trained to remove people from single-seater seats. In addition, on site there's a 16-bed medical centre, 4 critical care beds, an operating theatre, burn bay, radiology access. We also have permanently on standby sitting behind us, as you can see, a helicopter which is ours. It doesn't go anywhere else, it's not tasked for anything else. In rallying, there's about half a dozen guys, 2 Land Rovers and a big white van. About every 9 miles of special stage, there is a difference in the amount of resource, and that is worth talking about later. That doesn't mean that we're unequipped. This is the back of a van. You can see on the left-hand side there is space for a casualty on a fairly standard cot. You can also see that there is piped oxygen and piped nitrous. And we carry sufficient to allow us to do a transfer of over an hour. But also within this ambulance, which isn't really an ambulance, we also carry a set of hydraulic cutting gear, rams, and some firefighting equipment, with the idea that this team of people of whom I am part can, on their own, put out a fire, extricate a casualty from a vehicle, provide medical care and transport them to either hand over to county ambulance services or to definitive care. You'll all be familiar with the jaws of life. Those are some. These are hydraulic cutting shears, which will cut straight through most roll cages, really without turning a hair. When I started, that was the kit that a medical officer at a rally was expected to carry, and I know Mike Donald's sitting at the back there, but I wonder how Mike would feel about turning up at a major incident with a bag with that in it. I know that it would not be acceptable. Some bandages, a couple of litres of Hartmann's and some eye wash really ain't going to cut it if you are trying to deal with major trauma. Most of us now will carry some kind of kit like this in a backpack. This is my old one, actually. I now have a new bag. Really, that equipment is about providing access to the circulation and resuscitation fluid, oxygen and a number of ways of administering it, advanced airway access, cervical spine immobilization, ability to perform bilateral thoracostomies, and tracheostomy, which is a long way away from turn up with an eye wash bottle. The MSA, interestingly, are still using this 15 years later as their minimum kit list for doctors on motorsport events. People often ask about what drugs I carry, and that's changed over the years. This is currently my kit. You can't have everything. You just can't. The most important thing for me in that bag is ketamine. Ketamine is a fantastic drug. It's fantastic for controlling sedation, for controlling agitation. It's fantastic for controlling pain. You can use it to administer an anesthetic, all at different doses. More importantly than anything else, its effect on cardiovascular and respiratory systems seems to be minimal. There is some concern about its effect on intracranial pressure. That can be obtunded usually with the use of opiates or a small dose of benzodiazepine. Adrenaline is there as your catch-all keep somebody alive drug. Salbutamol is there because one of the things that I often end up dealing with is people who have left their inhalers at home and are wheezy. That's not about trauma. Morphine, obviously, and some antiemetics. I used to carry around the drugs that would be sufficient for me to do a rapid sequence induction. And as I became older and slightly wiser, I started to worry about the temptation of trying to do a rapid sequence induction in the forest on my own without trained assistance. And actually, to remove that temptation, I took the drugs away so that I couldn't do it. But more about that later. So some statistics, and I think it's really difficult for me to think back and see what actually I have done over the years in terms of treat patients or casualties at most sport events. You can always remember the deaths. And until last summer, I had been directly involved in 2 deaths, both of whom were dead before I got anywhere near them. I reckoned to send somewhere between 2 or 3 people a year into hospital, mostly with suspected spinal injury, most of whom were discharged afterwards. I've seen several compound fractures. I've seen 2 serious back injuries diagnosed at scene. And I've seen 1 significant head injury, and I will tell you that story a bit later. So that's over 15 years, and that gives you a flavour for, and that's me being out most weekends over the course of the summer. Paddy will tell you she doesn't see me much between March and the end of September. That's me being out most weekends at some point or another. So it gives you a flavour of how much I actually do. Sadly, last year and the year before we had a terrible year, and this has always been my nightmare. As a solo practitioner, I have always worried about cars leaving a rally stage and colliding with spectators, which is exactly what happened in two sequential events, one on the Snowman Rally up near Inverness in February 2013, and then actually there were two incidents where spectators were hit by competing rally cars on the same day in May 2014. The first incident resulted in somebody with a pelvic injury being taken to the Borders General Hospital. This one, sadly, the second one, which was attended first by a Dundee graduate, a good pal of mine who now works down as a GP in the Borders, who did a fantastic job, subsequently by me, resulted in 3 deaths and 1 patient with serious injuries who was subsequently airlifted to hospital. And in the days following it, those of us involved in special stage rallying in Scotland thought very hard about the threat to our sport, our hobby, that was posed by the fact that we had just killed 3 people. And we were very anxious about whether we would actually be allowed to continue. We were very anxious that the restrictions posed upon us by any subsequent legislation would be so onerous that it became financially impossible for us to continue, about which more in a bit. This was particularly relevant to me. I am the Chief Medical Officer for an event that happens on the Isle of Mull every October, and this, remember, was June. So it was July, August, September. We were starting at the beginning of October. For those of you that don't know Scotland well, Mull is a large island off the west coast of Scotland. Its population is about 7,500. It does have a small community hospital. Every October we take 150 rally cars across there, about 300 crew, about 500 mechanics and support crew, about 500 rescue crew and marshals, and about 5,000 spectators. And we run 150 miles of special stage rally. Most of it we run in the dark. So this is a picture of cars rallying in Mull in the dark. And we had to think very hard about how we were going to tackle Mull that year. And we thought about it in this quite simplistic but reasonably logical way. If there is an impact, what can we do to prevent injury? If there is injury, what can we put on scene there in a short space of time that can provide first aid provision? How can we get more advanced medical service to those people? And how do we get those people from there to secondary or tertiary care? And those seem to be the links in that chain of survival that we needed to address. And that doesn't project well at all, does it? We identified some opportunities in green at the top and some barriers to achieving that, and that will form the structure, perhaps, for the second half of my talk. So if we look at preventing injury after incidents first, then there was some stuff that we could have a go at. Vehicle engineering, largely outside our control, but feeding back on incidents and injury patterns from incidents in rallies has led to changes in vehicle design. Personal protection is worth a mention, as is stage design, and perhaps more importantly, spectator education. And some challenges to us about this sort of, we've always been like this, we've always been allowed to stand here behaviour. The fact that we don't want to make it too tame, and the fact that we are operating within limited resource. Vehicle design has moved on an awful lot, and I took these pictures last weekend down on the Scottish Rally in Dumfriesshire. This is a picture of, I can't remember his second name, Jock Armstrong's car. These are 2-inch pieces of relatively thin-walled, actually, boron steel. It's very solid. And because it is cross-braced across the car in multiple directions, that forms a safety cell into which ingression is difficult. What you'll also notice, if you look at the right-hand picture, is that the space that we have to get access to drivers or co-drivers when they do stack it is relatively small. And if you look at this picture of Dave Bogey's car, you can see actually that they are very confined within what is otherwise a reasonably large space. But car design, particularly when you see what some people have done to cars and walked away from, has made an extraordinary difference to injury patterns and increasing survival. The other big advance for us, and this doesn't project at all well, but is the HANDS device. The HANDS device is a rigid piece of polycarbonate that sits over the shoulders and has a ridge up the back. You can see here this arrow that connects to the helmet and prevents excessive flexion by transmitting force onto the chest. And the effect of that, when you look at a 40G deceleration, is to reduce the forces applied to the neck by a factor of 3 and reduce those forces applied to the neck well below that at which injury to cervical vertebrae or cervical ligaments is going to happen. This has become compulsory now in the British Rally Championship, and we have made it compulsory for the Tour of Mull this year. We can do a bit about stage design. One of the things that we can do is slow people down, and certainly on the long straight bits we will try and make them wiggly with stuff that is deformable rather than concrete blocks, with the idea that people will try and slow down to go around those corners that are artificial. And the other thing we can do is design the stage so that people are prevented access to dangerous parts of the circuit by taping them off and signing the direction of travel of cars so that people know where accidents are likely to occur. We can't do what happens at major racing circuits. We can't provide left to right large runoffs covered in gravel to slow cars down. We cannot provide 8-foot tall catch fencing along a 25-mile route. We can't provide tire walls for people to stand behind and arm cut. It is just too prohibitively expensive. So we end up with situations like that. It's not quite as bad as it used to be in the mid-90s. This is Colin McRae, God rest him, in the Rally of Portugal. The stage goes somewhere straight up the middle of the slide. So these guys standing in the middle of the stage are relying on the 5 guys standing outside them to move first. And I think if you were the guy standing in the middle of that, you've got bigger cojones than I have. One of our problems has been trying to educate spectators so that they don't do that. And we've tried actively to do that through social media campaigns, largely, but also through educational material that's embedded in rally websites and also in spectator programs. And we are encouraging now the active reporting by spectators of safety problems that they perceive to be threatening to the running of the event. Part of that is telling people what happens to rally cars. Rally cars go through corners sideways most of the time. They are under control, but they are not going in the direction that you expect them to. And people will stand in places that you would not believe. So trying to educate people so that we can reduce the risk to them is important to us. We also had an opportunity, we thought, to address some training at the marshalling pool and the safety review that I mentioned briefly as a consequence of the Jim Clark incident last year. We're providing now at every event in the British Rally Championship the opportunity, not compulsory yet, for marshals, spectators and competitors, and that's been key for us. The first person that's there at the scene of the incident is your uninjured mate that's sitting next to you in the car. Teaching them how to do rapid extrication in a safe way, and also some CPR with some additional information about scene safety. We've also engaged actively with the process of motorsport safety review, which has been led by this lady, Jackie Campbell. She's a lawyer and a civil servant. who knew nothing about motorsport, but has actually been very open to talking to the community and understanding how it works, and has actually produced a very sensible document which talks about training, control, risk assessment, role allocation, rather than imposing legislation upon the sport. And I think largely through her input we are going to be allowed to continue. So we can provide some first aid. The challenge now, of course, is getting access to more advanced care. We are working in austere environments. We are often short of telecommunications cover. Cells don't work in the forests. Line of sight is not always possible. There are often mountains away. So we rely on a radio network that we deliver ourselves. Along a rally stage at several points, there will be radio operators. But perhaps to explain this a bit better, try and understand response time particularly, we need an analogy. And that analogy really is that we are firing cars into a drain pipe. And the only way that we know that nothing has happened to that car is when they come out the other end. Yeah? We don't watch them all the way through, but we know that we've put car 15 in, and 15 minutes later car 15 should come out. You can cut holes in the pipe a bit. You can try and catch the numbers halfway down as they go past. Yeah? But there are 15 minutes when actually we do not really know what is happening inside that car. So we fire them in, and then this happens. Or not. Rats. Who made that play? Okay? That's happened somewhere in the tube. He knows about it, obviously. I don't know about it. The guys at the start don't know about it. We do run a system whereby if both of you are okay, you get out and you hold up or you display an OK board. If one of you is injured, then the uninjured member of the crew will display an SLS board. Those of you that are still thinking have worked out that if both of you are injured, then nothing is shown. And one of the things that we really struggle with in motorsport is the absence of anything is worse than an SLS board. It means that nobody's been able to get out and do it. But if we don't see that and another competitor doesn't report that, then we are waiting for those 15 minutes for a radio message to get from one end of the stage to the other. So we're already 15 minutes into our golden hour before anybody's moved. And remember, we've got 9 miles of stage to cover. And those 9 miles are not motorway. Those 9 miles are like this. This is real speed, me responding to an incident last weekend. And we are doing somewhere between 20 and 30 miles an hour. So if I've got 9 miles to cover at 30 miles an hour, I've eaten into my golden hour to the point at which we're 35 or 40 minutes away from that original impact. So we're going to arrive on scene and we're going to find something like that. That's actually after we'd finished with it rather than before we started with it. But it's buried somewhere in the forest, and it's actually down there. And we had to perform some cutting, obviously, as you can see from the stage, and an extrication to remove a semi-conscious and injured driver from that vehicle. So our extrication time, in the best will in the world, is going to be somewhere around about 20 minutes, which gives us about 5 minutes to get somebody to secondary care. And that isn't going to happen. We can attack some aspects of that. We can try and put some telemetry in cars, and systems are being developed now that can tell you what speed the car's doing, whether it's had significant deceleration, and which way up it is. The idea being that if it's not moving, it's just had a big bang, it's now upside down, something bad's probably happened. The challenge that we have is getting that information back from the scene to those people that need to act upon it. We can put more rescue groups in. The challenge here is cost, but we can shorten the distances between rescue groups. And on Mull we do that. We set ourselves a limit of 6 miles between rescue groups. And we practice really hard. We take cars and we put people in them and we cut them up and we take people out of them with the idea that we can streamline that extrication phase. But the gains are incremental. We're trying really hard. The last challenge for us, particularly on Mull, is about getting somebody from that advanced medical intervention to secondary care. And some opportunities here are about how we plan to go about that, involving statutory services, but also particularly local commitment from people that are around on Mull. We are challenged by location and weather, poor cellular phone access, significant anxiety about the change in search and rescue provision in this country, and also some very unclear responsibility about who was going to take charge of which bits of those process. Negotiations with the Scottish Ambulance Service have actually been extraordinarily useful. As we take across to Mull somewhere between 12 and 14 ambulances, 15 doctors and paramedics, we outnumber the local resource about 4 to 1, and offering to share that with the Scottish Ambulance Service for the duration of the weekend, in effect increasing their resource, has opened up a very, very useful collaboration with them. The EMRS guys are fantastic. The next slide I will show you about. We've also developed some clear communication pathways, largely between us and the air desk in Cumbernauld, which have allowed us to synchronise our activities a bit better. EMRS guys are fantastic. They will come and help, and they will come and do it at the drop of a hat. The challenge for us is that in a straight line, that's 110 miles from the base, 110 kilometres, from the base in Glasgow to the hospital at Craignure. I'll tell you a small story, which is about a guy that we cut out of a car in Greeben Cliffs. That's just above the F on the Isle of Mull there on the left-hand side. And his GCS at scene was somewhere between 10 and 11. We transferred him then to the local hospital, which was in Salem, and rang for some of the EMS guys to come and pick him up. And they did. It was brilliant. The sad thing was that in the middle of the night, fog descended in the Sound of Mull. They ended up diverting into Oban and waiting for one of the Coast Guard helicopters to come up from Gannet to pick them up and take them on to Mull. No fault of theirs, but we waited for 6 hours for the guys to arrive. And I think it was you, Mike, wasn't it? It was. I just remember, I think it was you. Yeah, so you remember the story, and you probably tell it much better. You did, that's right, yeah. While I sat with this guy whose heart rate went down and his blood pressure went up, and I was very anxious that what he had was an expanding intracranial hematoma about which we could do nothing. So we decided to tackle that. This is the newly built hospital. This is the Mull and Iona Community Hospital. It's a fantastic hospital. If you're ever there, go and say hi. They're a really good bunch of people. We started to open a negotiation with NHS Highland about how we could integrate our activity, the motorsport activity, better with theirs. There had always been a slight friction between the hospital, where care was provided well by local GPs, and the rally when it turned up. We would sort of dump them with a problem and go away. And that was not terribly useful. The other problem that we had was that people like me, with a lot of trauma experience and intensive care skill, would leave a patient with a local GP, not knocking them, but actually they have a different skill set, and not be able to assist them in the management of that patient. So we negotiated this year last the opportunity for 3 of us to have honorary NHS contracts with NHS Highland. That allowed us to work in their organisation. And we created the shortest, smallest intensive care unit in the world. That's it. We had 1 bed that we could ventilate. We could provide some advanced trauma care. We could resuscitate and we could package, hopefully, according to EMRS guidelines, patients for transfer. We also took across an ITU charge nurse, and we plan to do the same thing this year. If anybody else has a story that tells you about an intensive care unit that lasted shorter than 48 hours, I would love to hear it. But that's about engaging with local community and providing support to them while they allow us use of their facilities. And I think that's been a very productive relationship that we will continue. What about the future? Well, I think we are challenged by, in most sport medicine, the emergence of pre-hospital emergency medicine as a specialty. There are a bunch of people out there now that are trained to provide a staggering level of care in a very, very difficult environment. And the things that are key, perhaps, to us right now are on-scene rapid sequence induction, which I am still frightened about doing without the resource around me to support me. Thoracostomy for traumatic cardiac arrest, and the thing that is emerging now as a pre-hospital intervention is balloon occlusion of the aorta, with the intention of stopping distal limb hemorrhage. We can't do that. I can't go out and hire 15 pre-hospital care specialists. So somewhere we have to reach a compromise. Expectations going up all the time too. If there's one of these programs on every night, there's 3, and weavers in most of them. But this idea that the things that you do in the first hour are really important in determining your survival is now out there, and it is embedded in the consciousness. And that consciousness is also of rally drivers. As you've seen, we are severely challenged by the ability to provide that care. What can I do about it? Well, this is what I can do about it, and this is my next step for this year in the organisation of this event, with the idea that actually other people start to follow. You go out and you bring people along behind you. I think we need to move motorsport rescue away from take a wash bottle and a field dressing to train to provide high-quality pre-hospital care that's specific to that event. So for this event, I'm taking 2 guys across with me who are now working in pre-hospital care services, one in London, one in Glasgow, and we are going to equip them with fast cars containing an experienced paramedic and the ability to provide on-scene thoracotomy, on-scene rapid sequence induction. So they can be our second line of defence against these incidents. I've come to an end, and I think I've done it reasonably on time. I should thank these guys, particularly about organising the event on Mull. NHS Highland have been staggeringly helpful and engaged. We couldn't do it without the Scottish Ambulance Service and the Emergency Medical Retrieval Service. The guys at the bottom have lent us equipment and plan to do so again this year, so great thanks to those folk. That's all I have for you. I'd welcome any questions from anybody that wants to ask them.
Thanks very much, Ben. I remember going to Clumber Park in the mid-'80s when I was about 9 or 10, maybe even younger than that, to watch the rally cars. And I remember the Group B rally cars in the really early 80s. And we used to just stand on the apex of corners with our heads sticking out, waiting to see Harry Vatanen whiz past at 90 miles an hour. I look back and think, we were just crazy. But it was exciting, age 9, watching these people slide around. I'm sure people have got questions, but I've got a question. If it takes 20 minutes to reach these people who've just stacked their car, should you get a better driver?
Than me.
Well, you said in the Formula One you have race drivers who drive you to get now. Really clearly, it takes 20 minutes for you, but any of the rally drivers, they're not travelling 20 miles an hour; they're doing 70.
It's a fair comment, and it's a very reasonable question. There are 3 phases to rescue in rally circuits, as there are on race circuits too. And the first one is about scene safety. The second one is about extrication, and the third is about stabilisation. Me, on my own, in my car, can't do all those things. I need a bunch of people and I need a bunch of equipment. And if I took you back to the slide with the 2 Land Rovers and the big white van, all that stuff has to get there in time for us to start providing that support. We could try and go faster, but there is the old adage that to get there first you've got to get there. And while we do push on and we do try and get there as quick as we can, actually we are the only resource often for 20 or 30 miles in any direction. And if we end up wrapped around a tree, then we've made the situation worse. So we have to move with purpose and caution, I suppose. And while it doesn't directly answer the question, it perhaps gives you a bit of information around it.
Questions on the floor? Anyone got any questions or comments?
Come on, Mike, you must have something to say.
John.
John.
I'm interested in in whether there is a threshold of usefulness. If you can increase your resource and what you can do, but when there's a delay of an hour and people have had major trauma because a car's landed on them, what's your pickup rate likely to be with rapid sequence induction? Or
do you know what's really difficult? The statistics that I gave you, I scramble, if you want to use that word, to an instant about 3 times a year. And that's on the basis of 24 or 25 days out on motorsport events. So that's 1 in 8, roughly, 1 in 10, call it. Most of those patients are not injured. If they are seriously injured, they have probably already self-triaged. And that's certainly true of the deaths that I have been to. I have not been able to reverse the situation that I have found people in. The patient on the Snowman who was hit by a rally car in February 2013 did actually die despite medical intervention. I don't know what her cause of death was. We suspect it was internal hemorrhage, and that we could not do anything about that. The challenge for me actually is about the obtunded, head-injured patient. When there's increasingly good evidence from well-organised trauma services that good, advanced airway management early in the process with normalisation of CO2 and augmentation of hypoxemia does result in improved outcome. So that's the resource that I'm really trying to get there in a sensible period of time. We won't use it very often. And that's the argument that you have to fight against all the time. We've never needed that before. Well, you've never had it before, so you don't really know. You might have needed it before, you just don't know. So the challenge we have is balancing, putting a doctor behind every tree, and being proportionate about managing the risk. And I think this is a step that we can take that probably doesn't cost us much, that has the potential to offer some advantage.
Any more questions? Anyone? Any comments? Then I'll close up. As I say, it's 4 minutes to 2. So I'd just like to thank you all for coming. Thank Ben for a really very interesting talk on motorsport. And next week, Parkinson's disease. So a bit of a shift for next week. Thank you very much for coming. See you next week. And thank you, Perth. There you go.